It began with a visit to Guyana by Congressman Leo Ryan, some of his staff, and members of the press. He was later killed, along with 4 other Americans, including Don Harris and Robert Brown of NBC News. After the killings, the Guyanese authorities impounded the first tapes and notes made by the NBC crew.
I had appeared on a public television several months ago with a group of black professionals, mostly psychologists and doctors. They invited me to appear today to provide information that they thought might be that I might be able to help with this forum today, with their research. I appeared in Washington in February before the International Relations Committee and made some statements and some charges and documentation which resulted in the Foreign Affairs Committee, or International Relations Committee, which they call it today. They voted to ask the House Select Committee on Intelligence to investigate my charges. And they are currently investigating those charges by the House Select Committee on Intelligence.
Can you tell us what the charges are?
Well, the charges basically amounted to CIA contact with both the Burnham government there and with the People's Temple. That originally, it was my belief at the time I went to Washington that the purpose of our involvement there was to support the government of Burnham for commercial reasons, and they used the People's Temple almost as enforcers to help support an unpopular government there to keep control of the government of Guyana. We knew that there had been an article in the San Mateo Times in December of '79 which indicated that the Deputy Chief of Mission there, Richard Dwyer, was in fact the CIA station chief. And he was the one that went to Jonestown with Leo's party, and he claimed to be slightly wounded, but there was a tape made at the time of the murders and suicides there with Jones yelling, "Get Dwyer out of here, get Dwyer out of here." And the indications are that it was Dwyer who went back into Jonestown after Leo was murdered and was there at the time. And there's great question as just who shot Jim Jones and why, whether Jones was shot to shut him up. The question also as to how all these people died and just when they died, which is all documented here. But soon I came back from Washington because of my testimony. I started getting documentation from a Berkeley psychologist called the Penal Colony here, and from the Alliance for Preservation of Religious Liberty in Washington, which indicated other things, one of which was that George Philip Blakey was a top Jones aide. He was the man who arranged the purchase or the lease of the land in Guyana, provided the money and arranged the lease down there in 1974. He also is tracked now as being a CIA operative in Angola in 1975 with UNITA. He's also the same guy who was the top aide who arranged all this purchase and the finances, is also the husband of Deborah Layton Blakey, who fled Jonestown and made those charges. He's a brother-in-law of Larry Layton, who was acquitted yesterday. And it's interesting to note the Peninsula Times Tribune says yesterday the jury appeared, in acquitting Layton, the jury appeared to have agreed with the defense contention that Layton was brainwashed and drugged at the time of the shootings, could not be held criminally responsible. But the gist of what I'm getting to is this. I've received a lot of documentation, which I will value here today, that indicates the strong possibility that Jonestown and the People's Temple was in reality a mass mind control experiment conducted by the CIA as a follow-up to something called MK Ultra, which they conducted from the early 50s through 1974. They used to use the VA hospital and state hospitals. They used the federal and state penitentiaries for their experiments.
Do you think that Jim Jones was actively involved with the CIA?
I do now.
Do you have any conclusions as to how the people died in Jonestown?
Yes, I have part of our documentation here is a report from which is attached here. The chief medical examiner in Guyana is a Dr. Leslie Moto. He reported, and this is attached here, his opinion that more than 700 of those bodies found at Jonestown were not suicide victims but were murdered. He based this on the injection marks in the upper arm. Page 4 of my statement here.
By injection, they died?
Yes, and by gunfire. There were a lot more people killed by gunfire than they've ever admitted so far. We have heard reports that there were 50 of them, approximately 50 men with guns ringing around there, so people couldn't get out, and very few of them did get out. So it's according to the chief medical officer in Guyana, most of the people down there were murdered rather than suicide.
Who is suppressing all of this? Are you implying the CIA was active in the suppression?
Yes, I'm suggesting to you that a lot of things that don't make sense here. I'm suggesting that the long delay in anyone getting in, or the press getting in there, or very many people all getting in there for several days, was caused by a deliberate attempt to manufacture the story, which has now been accepted and sold successfully to the American people.
And what is that story that you think the people are falsely accepting?
That, in effect, this was a large group of disillusioned or disoriented black people who went down to Guyana and who turned their backs on this country and committed suicide, and we might as well we're get rid of them, and that was just an aberration type of thing. I think that's the story that's been peddled. When you see the documentation here, you'll begin to wonder yourselves why the first reports were 350 people died or 400 people died, and for several days that was reported, and then they started finding more bodies. When the first reports were that 500 fled in the jungle, the people examined the bodies the first time and counted them by name, by types of people, men, women, and children, turned them over. Then a few days later, they claimed to have found 2 and 3 stacks of bodies underneath those. You know, it boggles the mind, the stories that were passed out, but they apparently have gotten away with, I think, with one of the greatest fabrications of recent years.
What significance do you attach to the fact that the leadership of the temple was largely white and the membership of the temple was largely black?
I mentioned that in here. I think that that's part and parcel of the whole thing. I think that this is what caused me very suspicious about this whole experiment, about the possibilities here. The cadre was all white, and yet we think of Jonestown as a bunch of black people who were committed suicide without mentioning that white cadre, and that doesn't quite add up. I think there are racist overtones to the whole thing.
What kind of racist overtones? What are you exactly alleging?
I'm alleging that the media picture that was printed, it was painted rather, and then came out in print and so on, was that you don't have to worry about these people because they're crazy, they'll do anything, and they're not like us. It's my impression at this time that they were conducting some sort of mind control experiments. For example, they had a very modern hospital down there which they bragged about. So modern that in that population they had medical checkups for everyone every day. So there's no need for that unless you're conducting experiments where you're having control groups and you're giving people, and they're giving their vitamins every day. And it's my guess that they were just using them as guinea pigs to see what they could do under isolated circumstances. They take them off into a jungle someplace far away from everybody. They get them there somehow, and then they're able to see how these various drugs work on different groups.